Hi everyone, my name is Dishita Turakhia and I'm a PhD student at MIT CSAIL with Professor Stefanie Mueller. And I'm very excited today to talk about the work my co-authors and I did on studying if physical tools that adapt their shape based on a learner's performance can help in motor skill training. Currently, there are several shape-changing tools that use actuation to support with motor task execution. For example, this actuated desk and monitor system that moves up and down to change its height and orientation to support sitting in correct posture, or this actuated knife that protects the finger by locking the blade if it gets too close to it. While these shape-changing tools use actuation to ensure correct motor task execution, they do not help in mastering it. In our work, we study if shape-changing tools can also be used for motor skill training. In particular, we study if shape change that adapts the task difficulty based on learners' performance can be used for motor skill training. Take, for example, this adaptive basketball stand that we built, which changes the hoop height and width based on learners' performance. So as the learner gets better at the task, the tool adapts to increase the difficulty. And we study if such a tool helps in training of motor skills, for example, scoring of baskets. This approach of adapting task difficulty is already widely used in online learning systems, for example, these tools for learning math, that change the difficulty of math problems based on learner's skill level, so that every learner can learn on their own pace. A key benefit of these tools is that they make personalized learning accessible to a broader audience. But what about making learning of motor skills personalized and accessible in the same way? When it comes to motor skills, we are still limited to in-person coaching, where it is the trainer who adapts the task difficulty for the learner. So we asked ourselves, how can we build a physical version of a personal learning tool that automatically adapts the task difficulty for the learner during training? If we see the related work in tools for learning of motor skills, most systems rely on giving multimodal feedback on learners' performance. For example, the system that gives haptic feedback to the learner on violin playing, or these systems that give visual and tactile feedback on body posture for learning snowboarding and archery. Where our approach differs from this work is that we focus on adapting the task difficulty. And to adapt the task difficulty, we propose using shape change. And we were interested in studying if this combination of shape-changing tools and adapting task difficulty is useful in training of motor skills. To study this, we first built a shape-changing tool and then deployed an algorithm for adapting the task difficulty based on learners' performance during their training. We then conducted 2 user studies to test the learning gains in training with our auto-adaptive tool against training with conventional methods like static or manually adaptive tools. Let us first start with the shape-changing tool and motor skill. As mentioned earlier, we selected the motor skill of throwing a basketball in the hoop and built an adaptive basketball stand that adjusts its hoop width and the hoop height as the learner improves in their skill. For measuring the learner's performance, we mounted sensors on the tool. For example, to detect when a ball goes inside the basket, we mounted a switch sensor. And to detect when the ball hits the board, we mounted a piezo sensor. To trigger the shape change during adaptation of task difficulty, we used actuators, for example, the stepper motor to adapt the hoop height, and the servo motor to adapt the hoop width. The tool works in 3 conditions: static, where the difficulty remains constant during the training; manually adaptive, where the task difficulty can be adjusted by the learner anytime during the training; and auto-adaptive, where the task difficulty is adapted by our algorithm based on the learner's performance. Now that we have the shape-changing tool designed and built, let us move on to deploying an adaptive algorithm that decides when to adapt the task difficulty. And before we delve deeper, let's familiarize ourselves with 2 important terms often used in the field of motor skill learning: nominal task difficulty and functional task difficulty. Nominal task difficulty is basically the universal difficulty levels, for example, beginner, intermediate, or expert. and these difficulty levels are invariant to the learner's skill level. In our example, low nominal difficulty would be the easiest setting with the lowest hoop height and the widest hoop width, and the high nominal difficulty would be the hardest setting with the smallest hoop width and the highest hoop height. However, functional task difficulty is subjective to the learner's skill level. For example, a certain task might be more difficult for a novice or a beginner level learner, and hence the functional task difficulty experienced by that learner would be much higher compared to an expert for whom the same level might be at a low functional task difficulty. And our goal is to take learners from beginner level to an expert level, that is from low nominal to high nominal difficulty, by maintaining the functional task difficulty optimal, that is neither too easy nor too difficult. And we do this because studies have shown that learning with optimal functional task difficulty, or what we call an optimal challenge point, leads to higher learning gains. This is because at this point, the potential for learning benefit is the highest. So we deployed an algorithm that uses sensor data, calculates the score, computes the learner's performance, figures out the training difficulty level, and actuates the motors to adapt the tool to higher or lower difficulty level. Please refer to the paper for more details on the algorithm. Now that we have the shape-changing tool ready and the algorithm to adapt the task difficulty deployed, let's move on to user studies. In our first user study, we tested for auto-adaptive versus static condition. We recruited 12 participants and trained them on both conditions. In auto-adaptive, our algorithm adapted the tool, and in static condition, there was no adaptation, but half training was done in easiest setting and the other half was in the hardest setting. The training involved scoring baskets, and every scored basket was counted as 1 point, and a board hit was counted as half a point. We conducted the study in 5 stages. Before any training, we first did a pre-training test where the participants attempted 20 throws in the hardest setting. Then they trained on one of the 2 conditions. After that, we tested them on the hardest setting again to see if there was any learning gain after their training. We then trained them on the next condition, followed by a post-training test in the same way. The order of the training was randomized to compensate for the order effect. By comparing the learning gains, we can now analyze which training condition was useful. And it turns out that auto-adaptive condition is significantly more useful. The average learning gain after training on the auto-adaptive condition was almost 4 points, that is 20% higher in comparison to training on static condition. Not only the results, but even the feedback from the participants was promising. The Likert scale showing their preferences for training had auto-adaptive training rated higher. And the feedback suggests that auto-adaptive tool helped them focus better and feel motivated. For example, P7 said that seeing the changes in the tool was like having a personal trainer motivate them. We then moved on to our second study where we compared the learning gains of training on auto-adaptive condition versus manually adaptive condition. Like last time, we recruited 12 new participants and conducted the study in the same 5 stages. For manual setup, the participants used keyboard to adjust the hoop height and width and thus decide the training level to train on. We were interested in studying if the learners were given freedom to choose their training level, would they score better? And it turns out people are not very great at assessing their own skill levels and deciding what difficulty level to train on. We again got a significantly high learning gain post auto-adaptive training, this time more than 5 points, that is 25% increase in the score after auto-adaptive training. We noticed that the participants often either under-challenge themselves or over-challenge themselves by either setting the difficulty level too easy, thus losing the potential to learn, or setting the difficulty too high, again missing the opportunity to learn optimally. Take a look at the score chart of this participant, for example. It shows their score over 80 attempts during manual training where they over-challenged themselves. The blue line here shows their score, and the red dotted line here shows when they adapted the tool harder. As you can see, they set the difficulty too high early on and then struggled to score consistently for the rest of the training. And the same participant had a much more consistent score during auto-adaptive training and the difficulty adaptation was regularly spaced. And just like this participant, a couple others manually chose to train only on the hardest setting. This is because their post-training performance was being tested on the hardest setting. However, in spite of that, their scores were much better after training on auto-adaptive condition. Thus, it turns out that assessing one's own skill level and optimal training level is very hard. It is no wonder that when asked which training would they prefer in future, most preferred auto-adaptive training. One participant mentioned that they even trusted it more than themselves. And others found it easier as they didn't have to think if they had set the tool too easy or too hard. Of course, more longitudinal studies need to be conducted to gather data on long-term learning gains. Similarly, studies with higher number of participants also need to be done, and studies with other adaptive training tools also need to be done. But the results of our studies are significant because with such adaptive learning tools, we can now make personalized training accessible to learners who might not have access to trainers. This also opens up avenues for future work, especially in design of several shape-changing tools for motor skill learning, for example in sports like adaptive bike, or in rehabilitation like adaptive wobble board, or even adaptive wearables. Thus, in conclusion, we showed that physical tools that adapt their shape based on learners' performance and adapt the task difficulty during training leads to higher learning gains and helps in motor skill training. And with this, I look forward to your feedback and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.